Hi everybody, I'm Nathan Greider. I'm with the Illinois Department of Natural Resources, Aquaculture Program Specialist. I'm a graduate of UIS, and Dr. Lemke was my thesis advisor as well. I graduated in 2013. Happy to come back and talk to you about pond ecology and pond management. I also did some private pond consulting work for a few years in the central Illinois area. So this is meant to be just kind of a quick review of ponds, ecology, and management, and just give you an idea of certain things to think about pond construction, fisheries management, and so on. Some of these slides I borrowed from a colleague of mine, Blake Rubush, so I'll give him some credit for some of these too. Okay, so with brand new ponds and construction of new ponds, there's things to think about ahead of time. The watershed that the pond resides in is very important to how you might build the pond and how you might manage the pond. You can see pictures of a pond that I worked on just after the excavator's finished, so it was brand new. Kind of looks like a desert. There's really no habitat, plants or anything there. This is all fresh dirt work. And then the picture below that is just a year later after it was filled up. So it's important to think about ponds and lakes in a way as a disturbance in the environment. And if you think about the concepts of succession, ecological succession, once you create that disturbance in the environment, they do eventually want to revert back to a more stable state. They are holding back nutrients and sediments. They do fill in over time and eventually turn into a wetland and eventually turn back into basically terrestrial system. So that's why ponds tend to go through changes and age and cause problems later on. They are influenced by the geographic location that they're in, the climate. If they're obviously up in the far north, they're going to be colder water. Different animals, species are going to live there. And further south, they're going to resemble something very different. Soil types are also very important. If the soils around the pond and within the pond are very fertile, they can be just an algae factory. They're going to be eutrophic, and you'll have a lot of problems with trying to manage aquatic plants, algae, duckweed, and using herbicides and having fish kills and so on. Some ponds are very infertile and actually require fertilization to maintain a good fishery. Some southern states actually do fertilize lakes and ponds to increase productivity for a sport fishery. Activities in the watershed also affect the pond. Obviously, if there's row crop agriculture, nutrient runoff, these things can cause excessive nutrients and fish kills. Industrial activities may cause pollution. Also, things like golf courses or subdivisions with a lot of lawn fertilizers. These all affect the pond. The watershed size affects the pond as well. It's recommended that for every acre of pond or surface acre of pond that the watershed be 10 to 20 acres. We'll just call it 15 acres, or the ratio is 15 to 1 is what we recommend. If the watershed is much larger, you will have a lot of extra nutrients going into the pond, and the pond may not last as long because it's filling in faster with a larger watershed. If the watershed is too small, you can have not enough water, basically, where it doesn't maintain a stable water level. So when you're building a pond, you want to think about the size. The smaller the size of the pond, the more unstable they are, and maintaining a balanced fishery, and they're more vulnerable to fish kills. Depth is important, and it depends on where the pond is located geographically. For most of the Midwest, you want at least 10 feet deep to avoid fish kills. The shallower the pond, obviously the less likely fish can survive through droughts, hot spells, and long winters. Bank slopes is also important. You can see in the picture that that pond has pretty good slopes. If it's too steep, you have a limited littoral zone and a lack of plants, primary production from macrophytes. If the slope is too shallow, you can have way too much plant production and cause a lot of problems with recreation, and basically end up spending a lot more time trying to maintain the weeds and other issues that are growing in the pond. Spillways, that's important, best left up to an engineer as needed to figure out what size of discharge pipes are necessary. Habitat can be considered up front whenever you're designing the pond. That's a really good time to put in habitat, and we'll talk more about that. And of course, what are the goals for the pond? What are the recreation plans? Swimming? Is it waterfowl hunting? Fishing? These are all things to think about. Managing sediments and nutrient loads should be considered up front. Buffering from those issues, catch dams, and wetlands in the headwaters are always a good thing too, so that's important to consider. And then of course, one thing people don't often think about is maintenance activities, something that should definitely be planned on. They do cost money to maintain in a certain state, as we talked about, as they go through succession over the decades. It'll take some maintenance to keep it in a desirable state. Another very important part, and I hear a lot of this from different pond owners or people planning ponds, is it's important to have realistic objectives. You're not going to have a smallmouth fishery in central Illinois or a muskie fishery. Also, it's important too, especially if you're dealing with an association or multiple owners, that everybody has realistic objectives and works together. So that's some of the bigger issues, is just making sure that the nature will allow whatever it is that your objectives are with the pond. Okay, moving on. We'll talk about the water here briefly. Ponds in Illinois, at least. I know some of you are from throughout the country, or maybe even the world. But in Illinois, we have warm water ponds. Lake Michigan is a cold water area, but the rest of the state's pretty much considered to be warm water systems. Within the water and the ecosystem effects, you have temperature, nutrient influences, and dissolved oxygen. These all affect the pond system and the fishery. Temperature influences dissolved oxygen. We know, of course, that higher temperature you have less dissolved oxygen. Higher temperature also influences nutrients and decomposition, which also influences dissolved oxygen, as bacteria use up dissolved oxygen in the water, can cause fish kills. And it's kind of a vicious circle sometimes, and can lead to very unsightly and disappointing issues. Sometimes there's nothing you can do to prevent a fish kill; they just naturally occur. But there are things you can do to manage and reduce the likelihood. We know that many lakes and ponds stratify. I won't get into the details on that. You can see the image there. The three typical layers is the epilimnion, the metalimnion, and the hypolimnion. You have the thermocline is in that middle layer. and that's where, you know, suddenly the water temperature changes. When you jump in, sometimes you feel that cold spot. People think it's a spring. It is not. That is the thermocline. During the summer, below the thermocline in the hypolimnion layer, it often has no oxygen, very anoxic area with the fish can't hardly use it. There's hardly any decomposition going on because the bacteria have no access to oxygen. And that's where that muck layer is, a lot of sulfur gases, and basically that area is really, during the summer anyways, very cold and lacks oxygen. The water is very interesting when you think about it. Its highest density is at 39 degrees, and whenever it gets below that, it actually gets at the least dense and floats. The ice floats. It's very kind of interesting when you think about it. And so that's kind of how these ponds stratify, and they also turn over. You'll hear spring and fall turnovers as the air temperature changes. The water cools or warms up, the layers flip, the pond becomes mixed. Some people say or call it the pond taking a breath. So that's a interesting thing about water. You can look more into that, and I'm going to move on here to a typical fish stocking in central Illinois, at least. It may vary depending on where you're from. But as mentioned before, a lot of people want to throw in different species sometimes to just add excitement, and that's okay. Sometimes working with a biologist, you can throw smallmouth bass or muskie, and depending on the size of the water. But for a typical pond stocking in Illinois, we're going to go with largemouth bass, channel catfish, bluegill, and red-eared sunfish. These are all very popular. They are adapted to various conditions. They're very hardy. Some of these will take to artificial foods very well, and you can increase your production in the pond. Basically, the bluegill are near the bottom of the food chain, and then the bass feed on the bluegill, help keep them under control from being overpopulated and stunted. And then channel cat really are a optional species. They don't really affect one or the other very much, and people stock them if they want to. Many people do desire channel cat, but if you don't want them, it's really not that important to the stability of the food web, basically, in the fishery. Some of the undesirable species in ponds, common carp, they've been around. They were introduced in North America in the late 1800s. Some people would consider them naturalized by now, and that's probably accurate. But they do root around in the macrophytes, aquatic vegetation, cause a lot of turbidity, and can have some adverse effects. So if you can avoid it, you want to stay away from common carp in a pond. Bullheads is the next one. Those are a catfish species. They don't get very big. They're aggressive feeders. So some people do like them and stock them, but generally you want to avoid those. Yellow bass is another one. Gizzard shad, although fine in larger lakes and an important food source for sport fish, typically you want to avoid those in a small pond. Green sunfish is another very aggressive feeder that does not get very large and will compete with your other more desirable species. Talk real quickly here about fish kills. These are unfortunate when they happen. They can be very expensive for the pond owner, and after considerable time has been invested in developing a pond and a fishery, and then you wake up one morning and all your fish are dead. not happy, of course. A winter kill happens during prolonged snow cover and ice cover on the pond, where the lack of light penetration reduces photosynthesis for the algae that's occurring under the ice. Even during the winter, algae are still active in producing oxygen, but the system is, you could picture it as being kind of locked within the ice, so they have to maintain that oxygen production during this winter period. But with a prolonged, very hard winter with snow coverage and a lack of light, kind of a recipe for disaster, where the algae start to die. They start to be decomposed by bacteria, which also pull the oxygen out, and then the fish die. And once the ice melts, you'll typically see the fish floating, if they haven't already fallen to the bottom to decompose. So this does happen fairly often in some ponds, especially ones that are shallow and fertile and already have a heavy organic load. Some solutions for that, just real quickly, everything depends on, every pond's a little different, but you can deepen the pond, you can clear snow off the ice if it's been a particularly bad winter, carefully, of course. That, you know, it could be done with a four-wheeler and a blade, but obviously caution recommended there. Artificial aeration helps to keep the system open. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Some people think that just making holes in the ice will help during this time, but it really doesn't. It's not enough to let enough light in. And then a summer kill, this typically happens whenever you have a large algae bloom or some sort of a event that causes a lot of plant life or algae to die. Could be just a cold rain sometimes, or herbicide treatment that was not done correctly or done at a bad time whenever it's really warm. And so you have a lot of plant material in the water that dies, and then the bacteria go to work decomposing them and suck the water or the oxygen right out of the system. And let's see, so some solutions for that, typically maybe a big dredging project is pretty expensive, but that is one option. It's recommended that, at least in central Illinois, 25% of a pond be 7 to 10 feet deep at least. You'd be surprised how many ponds actually don't meet that criteria. Maintaining and controlling aquatic vegetation and algae with herbicides, or some people use grass carp. I won't get into that too much. But
maybe you should.
I think I have a vegetation slide. I'll talk more about the grass carp. So if you can try to get ahead of the vegetation and maintain it in a way that it does not become excessive, you can reduce the chance of a summer kill. And again, artificial aeration helps with that as well. And this shows an aeration system I installed for a client, and it shows pretty well how that bottom layer of water, you can see that darker color is actually clearer water. This was after a rain event, so you can see how the pond is being mixed. And here's just kind of a quick graphic showing what's going on. You have an air compressor system on the bank of the pond, and then the air line that runs down to a diffuser, and the diffuser is putting oxygen bubbles into the water, and it's not so much as putting oxygen directly in, but it's that movement of water volume from the bottom layer to the surface to be mixed with the atmosphere. And so that basically keeps the pond in a mixed state as opposed to being stratified, and it also helps to improve oxygen in the bottom of the pond for decomposition and overall a healthier pond. some caution should be taken with these. Some people will just put them in a pond, turn them up on full blast and let them go, and then find out they have a fish kill a couple days later. And that's typically because you shock the system and hit it with too much oxygen at one time, and it can cause an issue. So it's something you need to do gradually, especially in a older pond. Aquatic vegetation, there's a lot we could cover here. We're just going to skim the surface. They can be good in, obviously, very good habitat, primary production in the pond, and so on and so on. A lot of times they can go bad and be too aggressive and hinder fishing. Let's see, the picture on the top over here was beneficial aquatic plants I installed in a pond with an exclusionary fencing to reduce grazing while the plants were getting established. You can see we have some arrowhead, bulrush, and some white water lily. These are all native to Illinois. It's important to make sure that the aquatic plants are native to the area. They're not going to be too aggressive. Here's a pond covered in duckweed. This is pretty common. It can be treated. It can get a little bit costly and frustrating to try to treat ponds that have very bad duckweed or algae problems. The plants, of course, they provide cover for the fish and are a good refuge for small fish to escape predators. Sometimes too much, actually, to where whenever you have too much plants, the bass can't get to the bluegill very well, and then you have a situation where somebody may do a drawdown event to help flush them out and give the bass an extra growth spurt. Different scenarios that managers use. Okay, so grass carp, I mentioned that earlier. Grass carp have been used for decades for pond management. In Illinois, they have to be triploid, and there's a permitting process for that. But it's pretty straightforward. I work with those on a daily basis. Whenever the grass carp are stocked, there's certain plants they desire to eat more than others, no different than a person at a buffet may go for some things they like more than something else. And they really have to be almost overstocked in order to have a positive effect for reducing the plant that is desired. If you don't stock enough, you typically won't see any difference, but whenever you hit that threshold of having almost one too many, that's typically where you notice that the ponded plants are being cleaned out and removed by the grass carp. However, they don't eat planktonic algae, so a lot of times they can tip a pond over the threshold to being more green and almost a pea soup appearance, and that's because you have no rooted plants that are growing any longer, and the nutrients are still available no matter the situation, and so the planktonic algae will take over and turn the pond green, and that can also put the pond at a higher risk of a fish kill. So grass carp are one option to consider. I would say not quite as popular as they used to be, but it just depends on different situations. Moving on to habitat enhancement projects. These are pretty fun, actually. You see on the top corner here, this is called the Georgia Cube. It's obviously a PVC frame, and then this black material here, this is drain tile polyethylene pipe. Lasts for decades, relatively safe, and it basically becomes colonized by algae and zooplankton hang out around it, and an entire food web basically develops around this little structure. And then the large fish hang out there, and then the fishermen also target these for fishing. And In a pond, especially a brand new pond, you can see this image on the right, without this structure added, it is mostly a desert. There's no refuge for fish, and we know from basic ecological principles that the more diversity you have in a system, the more species that it typically holds, and the more resilient that it is. So having these structures in the pond do help the system to be more stable and a better fishery. I put the picture of the plants back in because obviously that's good habitat. And then there's lots of different artificial structures that can be purchased. These are called porcupine balls here on the bottom left. Here's another pond that was set up after construction with some woody brush piles, and that's also good. These have a shorter lifespan, so after a while they're going to decompose, but for a while they provide good natural habitat. And other things that people do would be adding rock piles, and assortment of different other structures can be done. So okay, so that's going to be it. Just a real quick tour on pond ecology and management, and for some additional reading, I'd recommend the IDNR iFish website, and then we produced a book called The Management of Small Lakes and Ponds in Illinois. A lot of the things I covered are in there, and some additional things that I did not. So that's all I have, and if you have any questions directly to me, I think I had my email on the front. Otherwise, Dr. Lemke could get a hold of me. Thank you.